Silence is the loudest sound a person can make when they finally stop begging to be heard. There is a moment, and you will know it the second it happens, when you stop replying immediately, stop double texting, stop explaining yourself, stop trying to be understood by someone who never really tried to understand you. And in that exact moment, something strange happens. The energy shifts, the power moves. Not because you did anything dramatic, not because you screamed or cried or made a scene, but because you simply stopped. You went quiet. And quiet, when it's unexpected, is terrifying to the person who got used to your noise. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about playing games. This is about psychology, real, documented, human psychology. And what happens inside someone's mind when the person they took for granted suddenly disappears from their radar without a word. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to explain isn't just theory. It's been studied, it's been proven, and once you understand it, you will never look at silence the same way again. In fact, in the next 60 seconds, I'm going to show you the exact psychological shift that happens inside a person's brain the moment you go quiet, and it is not what you expect. Most people think ignoring someone is a punishment. It's not. It's a mirror. When you stop chasing, stop reacting, stop performing for someone's attention, you're not hurting them. You're simply removing yourself from a stage they didn't even realize they were relying on. And the human brain does not handle sudden absence well. It was built for connection, for pattern, for prediction. When a pattern breaks, when the person who always texts back, always shows up, always forgives, always chases, suddenly stops, the brain treats it almost like a small trauma. Not because they love you more in that moment, but because their entire prediction model just collapsed. But here's the part that will genuinely surprise you, the part most people never talk about, the part that happens around day 3 of true silence. And if you don't understand what's coming, you could ruin the entire process without even realizing it. Keep watching, because this next part changes everything. Let's slow down for a second, because I want you to actually feel this, not just hear it. Think about someone in your life, maybe a partner, maybe a friend, maybe a family member who you have chased, not necessarily romantically. Chasing looks like a lot of things. It looks like being the one who always calls first. It looks like over explaining yourself when you didn't do anything wrong. It looks like shrinking your needs so you don't seem too much. It looks like laughing off disrespect because confronting it feels scarier than accepting it. If any of that sounds familiar, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not weak for doing it. Humans are wired for connection so deeply that we will sometimes accept a distorted version of it rather than face the fear of losing it completely. That's not a character flaw. That's biology. That's attachment theory in real time. Attachment theory tells us that from the moment we are born, we form patterns of how we expect love, attention, and safety to be given to us. If, growing up, love felt inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes there, sometimes not, the brain doesn't learn this is unsafe, avoid it. Strangely, it learns the opposite. It learns inconsistency equals importance. This is why so many people find themselves endlessly drawn to relationships, friendships, or dynamics where they have to work for affection, where they have to prove their worth over and over again, where being ignored for a few hours feels more intense and addictive than being loved consistently. It sounds backwards, but it isn't. It's called intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the most powerful psychological forces behind why people stay in situations that hurt them. Intermittent reinforcement was first studied in a much simpler context. Animals, actually. Researchers found that if you reward a behavior every single time, the subject learns the pattern quickly, but the drive for that reward stays relatively stable. But if you reward the behavior unpredictably, sometimes yes, sometimes no, no clear pattern, the drive to keep pursuing that reward becomes far stronger, far more obsessive, far harder to walk away from. Slot machines are built on this exact principle. You don't win every time. You win just often enough to keep pulling the lever, hoping this time will be the time. Now apply that to a person who is warm sometimes and cold other times, attentive sometimes, distant other times, loving sometimes, dismissive other times. That unpredictability doesn't push people away as often as you'd think. It pulls them in deeper and deeper because the brain becomes convinced that the next moment of warmth is right around the corner if it just tries a little harder. This is exactly why going silent, why truly ignoring someone, not out of spite but out of self respect, creates such a powerful shift. Because for possibly the first time, you are removing yourself from the unpredictable cycle entirely. You are not reacting, you are not chasing the next crumb of attention. You are simply stepping back and observing. And when you do that, you flip the entire dynamic on its head because now the other person is the one left wondering, left guessing, left in that same uncomfortable state of uncertainty they used to put you through without even realizing it. Here's where it gets uncomfortable though, because I want to be honest with you instead of just telling you what feels good to hear. Ignoring someone will not automatically fix a broken relationship. It will not automatically make someone who never valued you suddenly value you. This isn't a magic trick, and if you're doing it purely as a manipulation tactic to win someone back, you're missing the actual point, and you're also going to be disappointed. The real power of silence is not what it does to the other person. The real power of silence is what it does to you. Because in that quiet space, the space where you're no longer performing, no longer explaining, no longer chasing, you start to hear yourself again. You start to notice things you were too busy, too anxious, too hopeful to notice before. Think about how much mental energy it takes to constantly monitor someone else's mood, to read their text 3 times before responding, trying to decode hidden meaning in a single punctuation mark, to replay conversations in your head at 2 in the morning, wondering what you could have said differently, to shrink your personality, your needs, your boundaries, just to keep the peace, just to avoid the sting of their disappointment or distance. That is exhausting. That is a full-time unpaid job that your nervous system has been running in the background for who knows how long. And when you actually stop and go quiet, that energy has nowhere else to go except back into you. This is where people report the strangest, most unexpected side effects of going silent. They start sleeping better. They start noticing hobbies they had abandoned. They start remembering what their own voice sounds like when it's not shaped around someone else's approval. And ironically, this is also usually the exact moment the other person notices something has changed. Because people can sense energy even when they can't explain why. They might not consciously think, I am being ignored. What they feel instead is a subtle absence, a gap where your attention used to live. And that gap creates discomfort because humans are creatures of pattern, and broken patterns demand to be investigated. Now let's talk about what actually happens on the other side, because this is the part everyone wants to know. And I promised I'd bring you back to it. Around day 2 or 3 of consistent, calm, non-reactive silence. Not cold, not dramatic, just calm. Something shifts in the other person's nervous system. Their brain starts running a background process, almost like an internal alarm, asking, why hasn't this happened yet? Why hasn't the usual pattern repeated itself? If you were the one who always reached out first and you don't, their brain doesn't just shrug it off. It searches for the explanation. Did something happen? Are they upset? Did I do something wrong? This isn't guaranteed to make someone chase you. I want to be very clear about that because I'm not here to sell you a fantasy, but it does guarantee one thing. It disrupts the autopilot they were running on. And disruption, more often than manipulation ever could, creates real reflection. But here's the twist, the part that separates people who use silence in a healthy way from people who use it as a weapon. If your silence is rooted in bitterness, in trying to control someone's emotions, in secretly hoping they'll suffer, it will eventually leak out, even if you don't say a word. People can feel resentment radiating off someone even through absence. But if your silence is rooted in peace, in simply choosing yourself, in refusing to perform for love that should be freely given, in trusting that you deserve consistency instead of chaos. That energy is completely different. It doesn't scream, "Come back to me." It quietly says, "I'm okay either way." And that, more than any dramatic gesture, is what genuinely unsettles people who are used to being chased. Let's bring this into a real scenario, because I know some of you are thinking about a specific person right now while listening to this. Maybe it's a partner who only shows real interest when they sense you pulling away. Maybe it's a friend who disappears for weeks and only resurfaces when they need something. Maybe it's a parent whose approval you've been chasing your whole life without ever quite catching it. The mechanism is the same across all of these relationships because human attachment doesn't care about the label of the relationship. Romantic, platonic, familial, it cares about the pattern of reward and neglect. If you've spent years being the one who initiates, the one who forgives too quickly, the one who explains away red flags because the good moments felt just good enough to justify staying, you are not broken. You were simply trained, slowly and quietly, to accept less than you deserve. And unlearning that training takes more than willpower. It takes practice. And ignoring someone, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation, is one of the most direct forms of that practice. There's a concept in psychology called extinction burst, and it explains something crucial about why the early days of silence often feel worse before they feel better, and why some people give up right before the shift actually happens. An extinction burst is what occurs when a behavior that used to get a reward suddenly stops getting rewarded. And instead of the behavior fading away quietly, it temporarily spikes. Think about a vending machine that eats your money without giving you a snack. You don't just walk away calmly. You press the button again, harder, you shake the machine, you might even hit it. That intensified reaction, right before giving up entirely, is the extinction burst. Applied to relationships, this means that when you stop responding to the same old patterns, stop reacting to guilt trips, stop chasing, stop over explaining, the other person's behavior might actually intensify at first. More texts, more attempts at contact, more charm, more apologies, more promises. This can feel confusing, even validating in a twisted way, like proof that ignoring them is working. But it's also the exact point where many people cave because the sudden burst of attention feels like the payoff they were hoping for, and they rush back in, resetting the entire cycle from scratch. Understanding this is crucial because it means the goal was never to provoke a reaction for the sake of a reaction. The goal is congruence, becoming a person whose actions actually match their own boundaries and self-worth, regardless of whether the other person notices, apologizes, or changes. If you go silent purely to trigger a chase and then abandon your boundary the second they show interest, you haven't actually changed the dynamic. You've just paused it. The real transformation happens when your silence isn't a strategy anymore, but a genuine reflection of the fact that you no longer need someone else's reaction to feel like you matter. Now, I want to address something a lot of people feel guilty about because I think it needs to be said clearly. Choosing silence, choosing distance, choosing to stop overgiving to someone who isn't reciprocating is not cruelty. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us were taught that being nice means being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly patient, no matter how we're treated. But there is a very real difference between kindness and self-abandonment. Kindness says, "I will treat you with respect." Self-abandonment says, "I will treat you with respect even when you don't extend that same respect to me, because I'm afraid that if I stop, you'll leave." And being left feels more painful than being mistreated. That fear is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But the truth is, someone who only shows up for you when you stop showing up for them was never fully present in the relationship to begin with. They were present for the version of you that made their life easy. Silence, in this context, isn't about punishing them. It's about finally introducing them to the real terms of being close to you. Terms that include mutual effort, mutual respect, and mutual presence. Let's go a little deeper into the psychology of why watching someone from a distance, emotionally, not literally stalking their every move, let's be clear about that, reveals so much about their true character. When you're actively engaged, constantly communicating, constantly available, people don't have to reveal their real priorities because you're doing the work of keeping the connection alive for both of you. But the second you step back, the mask, if there is one, becomes very hard to maintain. If someone genuinely values you, your silence will create discomfort, and that discomfort will translate into effort. A real conversation, a real apology, a real change in behavior, not just words. But if someone was only ever comfortable with you as long as you were convenient, your silence will reveal that too, often through their own silence in return, or through indifference, or through moving on without a second thought. Both of these outcomes, painful as the second one might be, are actually gifts because they give you information. And information, especially about how someone truly feels about you, is worth more than months or years of guessing. I think this is the point where I need to gently remind you of something because it's easy to get caught up in the idea of silence as some kind of power move and forget the human being on the other side of it. And more importantly, forget the human being doing it, you. This isn't about becoming cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable as a personality trait. It's a temporary, intentional recalibration. It's you saying, even if only to yourself, I am not available for confusion anymore. I am not available for one sided effort anymore. I am not available to shrink myself in order to keep someone comfortable. That's not manipulation. That's boundary setting in its most honest form, even if it's silent, even if the other person never fully understands why it happened. Let's talk about time, because time plays a bigger role in this than most people realize. There's a reason this shift doesn't happen in a single day, and understanding the timeline can help you avoid the trap of giving up too early or reading too much into what happens too soon. In the first 24 to 48 hours of genuine silence, most people notice very little, or they notice increased anxiety in themselves rather than any visible change in the other person. This is normal. Your nervous system has been running on a certain pattern for a long time, and breaking a pattern, even a harmful one, feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. Somewhere between day 2 and day 5, depending on the depth of the relationship and how attached the other person was to the previous dynamic, the shift usually becomes visible, sometimes through direct contact, sometimes through mutual friends, sometimes through subtle changes like suddenly liking an old photo or resurfacing after long silence themselves. Beyond that window, if there's still no change at all, that silence starts to answer a different question entirely. Not will they notice, but was this relationship built on something real to begin with? I want to pause here and say something that might be uncomfortable, but I think you deserve honesty rather than a comforting lie. Sometimes the silence reveals that the person truly doesn't care, that they were never going to reach out, that the connection you thought you had existed mostly in your own hope rather than in reality. If that happens, it is not a failure of the technique. It is not proof that you didn't do it right. It is simply proof, painful but valuable proof, that you deserve someone who doesn't need to be taught how to value you through absence. Someone whose presence and effort come naturally without needing a lesson in what losing you might feel like. But let's talk about the version of this story that ends differently, because it happens far more often than people expect, especially in relationships where there was genuine love or connection buried under bad habits, poor communication, or unresolved insecurity. When someone realizes through your silence that they had been taking your presence for granted, real change can happen, not performative change, not temporary charm to win you back and then slide right back into old patterns, but a genuine internal shift. This usually shows up as increased vulnerability. They start initiating conversations that go beneath the surface. They start acknowledging specific things they did wrong instead of vague, generic apologies. They start showing up consistently, not just in the emotionally charged aftermath of realizing they might lose you, but in the weeks that follow when the initial fear has faded and old habits could easily creep back in. This consistency after the initial reaction is the real test because anyone can show up intensely for a few days when they're scared. Far fewer people show up quietly and reliably once the fear has passed. This is why silence, used correctly, becomes less about winning someone back and more about filtering reality from illusion. It removes your own performance from the equation so you can see clearly what someone does when there's nothing being extracted from you anymore. No effort you're putting in that they can coast off of. No emotional labor you're providing that lets them avoid doing their own inner work. Just quiet and whatever true feelings exist underneath all the noise that used to distract from them. There's another layer to this worth mentioning because it explains why this concept resonates so deeply with so many people, far beyond romantic relationships. Think about workplaces where someone overfunctions, always available, always saying yes, always the one who stays late, and is quietly taken advantage of because their reliability is treated as infinite rather than valuable. Think about friendships where one person always plans the get togethers, always remembers birthdays, always checks in, while the other person simply enjoys the benefits without ever initiating anything themselves. Think about family dynamics where one person is expected to keep the peace, absorb the tension, and hold everything together, while everyone else assumes that role will always be filled without needing to ask who's filling it. In every single one of these situations, the same principle applies. The moment the person who overgives stops giving, not out of spite, but simply because they finally recognize the imbalance, the entire system feels the disruption. Suddenly, tasks don't get done. Suddenly, effort has to come from somewhere else. Suddenly, the people who benefited from that person's overextension are forced to either step up or reveal that they never intended to. This is why the title of this video isn't really about one specific person, even though I know many of you pictured someone specific the moment you clicked. It's about a pattern that shows up everywhere in life, quietly shaping who gets respected and who gets taken for granted, based almost entirely on who is willing to keep giving without ever pausing to ask, is this being reciprocated? And the antidote to that pattern isn't dramatic confrontation, isn't ultimatums, isn't even necessarily a conversation at all, at least not at first. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop and observe what happens in the space you leave behind. I also want to touch on something psychologically important here, which is the difference between silence used from a place of fear and silence used from a place of self respect, because they can look identical from the outside but feel completely different on the inside. And that internal difference is what actually determines the outcome. Silence from fear sounds like this internally. If I say something, they'll get angry, so I'll just stay quiet and hope things get better on their own. That kind of silence is passive. It's avoidance wearing the costume of strength. It usually comes with resentment simmering underneath, and eventually it either explodes or slowly poisons the relationship from the inside. Silence from self respect sounds completely different. I've said what I needed to say. I've expressed my needs. And now, instead of repeating myself endlessly or begging to be understood, I'm going to step back and let actions speak, both theirs and mine. That kind of silence is active. It's not about hiding from conflict. It's about refusing to participate in a cycle that clearly isn't working anymore. Learning to tell the difference between these two versions of silence within yourself is honestly more important than any external result. Because if your silence comes from fear, even if it works and the other person comes chasing after you, the underlying dynamic hasn't actually changed. You'll just be back to walking on eggshells, back to over explaining, back to shrinking yourself the moment things feel unstable again. But if your silence comes from genuine self respect, then no matter what happens on the other side, whether they come back changed, whether they don't come back at all, whether the relationship transforms into something healthier or quietly ends, you walk away from the experience having learned something you can't unlearn, that your peace does not depend on someone else's attention. I think it's worth naming the physical side of this too, because psychology never lives purely in the mind, it lives in the body. When you're stuck in a cycle of chasing someone's approval, your nervous system is often in a low grade state of alertness almost constantly, scanning for signs of rejection, replaying interactions, bracing for disappointment. This isn't just emotionally exhausting, it's physically exhausting. It can show up as trouble sleeping, tension headaches, a tight chest, a restless mind that won't quiet down even when you're trying to relax. When you step back from that cycle, when you stop feeding that hypervigilance by removing the source of unpredictability from your daily attention, your body often responds before your mind fully catches up. People frequently describe feeling like they can breathe again, even before they consciously process why. That physical relief is not a coincidence. It's your nervous system finally getting permission to stand down from a threat response it's been running for far longer than it should have. I also want to be honest about the fact that this isn't easy, and I'm not going to pretend that watching a video makes it simple to suddenly detach from someone who has occupied so much space in your mind. The urge to check their online status, to reread old messages, to find a reasonable excuse to reach out will likely show up, sometimes stronger than you expect. This is normal. This is not a sign that you're failing at this. It's a sign that you're human and that attachment, even to something unhealthy, doesn't disappear just because you've made a decision in your head. The goal isn't to feel nothing. The goal is to keep choosing yourself, moment by moment, even while feeling the pull to go back to old patterns. Over time, that pull weakens, not because you stopped caring entirely, but because you started building evidence, real lived evidence, that you can survive discomfort without immediately fixing it by chasing someone else's approval. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. Ignoring someone completely, when it's done from a place of clarity rather than bitterness, isn't about punishing them. It's about interrupting a pattern that was quietly costing you your peace, your confidence, and your sense of self. It reveals character, both theirs and yours. It creates space for truth to surface, whether that truth is, this person genuinely values me and just needed a wake up call to show it, or this person was never going to reciprocate what I was giving, and now I finally know that for certain. Both outcomes, as different as they feel, move you forward. Both outcomes free you from the exhausting in between of not knowing. And maybe, as you've been listening to this, a specific face has kept appearing in your mind. Maybe it's someone you've been chasing for weeks, months, or even years. Maybe it's someone you already stopped talking to, and you're wondering whether the silence you're sitting in right now is fear or self respect. Maybe it's someone who hasn't even noticed you've pulled back yet. And that itself is telling you something you don't want to hear. Whoever it is, I want you to sit with this question honestly, not for me, not for the comments, but for yourself first. Are you giving someone your energy because they've earned it through consistent effort, or because you're afraid of what silence might reveal if you finally stopped and looked at the relationship clearly? I genuinely like to know your answer, or at least the version of it you're comfortable sharing. So tell me in the comments below what happened the moment you finally stopped chasing someone and let silence do the talking instead. Did they notice? Did they change? Or did the silence simply teach you something about yourself that you needed to hear all along